Aha, brilliant. It looks good on your screens now as well. This is a nice room with these three big screens. What you perhaps don't appreciate is that when you face in this direction, there are three big clocks. So it's quite a well-designed room in several dimensions. Kenneth asked me to speak about healthy aging as a global challenge, and as he said, I direct the Umeå Center for Global Health Research, which is in the north of Sweden, is a FAST-funded center of excellence. But not surprisingly, because we are a center for global health research, of course, we have spent some time thinking what global health really is. What do we mean by global health? It's a very popular, even I might say fashionable topic these days, but what is it? And to cut a long story short, we take a very inclusive view of what global health is. It's not about the health of those people out there, over there, wherever they might be. It's actually inclusive global health. And for that reason, I'm going to begin where we have been for much of the day in Sweden. And just to highlight a few things about Sweden as a kind of baseline, if you like, for our venture into the aging situation globally in the world. And I'm not taking Sweden currently, as you can see from the heading. This is Sweden in 1860, so quite some time ago, and an absolutely classic, what demographers and epidemiologists call a population pyramid. And when you look at this, it's not hard to work out why it's called a population pyramid, because it's about the population and it's very clearly a pyramid. And you can see there are a few characteristics that stand out here. By far the biggest bar is the under 5, so you've got high child mortality, because that's the only way that you can get from here to here is if some of them die. But what we're really interested in from our perspective here is what's going on up at the top, and the top is looking very anorexic here. It's a very thin, pointed area of the pyramid. There were very few, proportionately, older people so long ago in Sweden, and that's not a surprise, but it's interesting observation. What I'm going to do now is to start the clock ticking, and we'll just run through and see what happens fairly fast. So just keep your eyes open, particularly keep your eyes on this top bit of the pyramid and see what happens as we go. So we're going in 5-year steps. You can see already the bottom is getting narrower and the top is beginning to get broader. We're nearly up to the end of the 19th century here, coming into the 20th century. Still a pyramid, but now a slimmed down pyramid. The early 20th century, and now for the first time the bottom's getting narrower and the top's getting wider. And briefly, we have a lovely Swedish Christmas tree around the post-war time. But soon that disappears, and in the 60s and the 70s, and you can see we're becoming less and less of a pyramid. Very strange shapes, bits and pieces, the baby bulge going upwards. 2000 now, not so long ago, almost up to date and getting squarer and squarer, and we can carry on. We don't have to just stop because we've arrived at today. And you see it gets squarer and squarer and squarer, and it's going to go all the way up to 2050, and you see finally we get to the point where the top is dominating the bottom in proportional terms. That's a very quick history of Swedish population, and of course there's a whole lot of detail in there that we can't explore at that speed. But it is an important illustration, an important baseline for understanding what's actually going on and what has been going on, what will be going on in the rest of the world. So having taken the Swedish population from the past to the future, let's move on now to the global situation. This is the 2010 global population, and I've color-coded it here for 3 classifications of countries. These classifications of countries are always a little bit arbitrary and tricky, but anyway, I've taken the terminology least, less, and more developed countries as defined by UN Population Division. And this is quite surprising, I think. I don't know whether you'd ever thought what such a pyramid might look like, but the thin blue bit up the middle is the more developed countries. So that's Western Europe, Northern America, Japan, such like. And you can see, well, it's a fairly small proportion of overall population. But you might have thought that actually that pale blue would really dominate this top area. And the thing that surprises me here is that, or at least at first sight surprises me, is that it doesn't. There's a significant proportion of that pale blue in the older age group, but there's a very significant component of this pink color. The pink is basically China and India and some more countries, but you know, any grouping of countries, once you've got China and India in there, they're the ones that really drive it. So you can think of the pink as China and India and some more. The red, which is still very much down at the bottom of the age spectrum currently, well, a couple of years ago, the red is the poorest countries, so that's basically sub-Saharan Africa and some others. They are up here in small numbers, but too small numbers for you to actually see them on this scale. If we take this picture forwards, now I've jumped from now to 2050. We seem to have a bit of a fixation on 2050, but that's where a lot of the current population estimates actually run to at the moment, and it's a convenient kind of point in time. You can see, if I just go back again so that you can see the difference, you see it's not the bottom that's changing hugely, it's the top that's changing. It's really filling out in the top. And for the first time, there are admittedly not huge numbers, but there are numbers of the poorest, the least developed, the red bars coming up into this area. And the pink up here is way outnumbering the blue. So that's the world that we're moving towards in terms of aging. So in a few decades' time, there will be not only will there be a lot more old people, but most of them will not be in rich countries. That's the really important point of this slide. So there will be more old people, but a smaller proportion of them will be in what we think of as the aging populations, the richer countries of the world. Now, if we take some specific examples, and I'm going to use Ethiopia as a source of specific examples. It's a place where my unit has done quite a lot of work. We know it quite well. We have quite a lot of information. And of course, it's one of the world's poorest countries. It's not right at the bottom of the spectrum, but it's pretty well down. And this is a typical, maybe we could have the lights a little bit dimmer actually so you can see this a little bit better. But this is a typical household in rural Ethiopia. You can see it's distinctly poor, and the reason I chose this picture is because there's this relatively old guy sitting here outside his house. I don't know exactly how old he is, but he's probably in his 60s. So he's probably in this key group of 60 plus, 65 plus in the poorer parts of the world. There's a lot of little kids around, as is usually the case in Africa, and I don't know much about this particular household, but maybe they're his grandchildren or whatever. But let's actually look at this now, not in pictures, but let's look at some analytical examples of what's actually going on in a setting like this, which of course is a massive contrast compared to the Swedish setting and what we've been hearing about and talking about most of the day. in a particular part of Ethiopia, and this is a very interesting little story, a particular part of a particular small part of Ethiopia, there was a major crisis. It was actually a climate-driven crisis. It wasn't a drought, but it rained at the wrong time of year. And there were major epidemics, both related to malaria and related to diarrhea in 2 seasons. That's not the important part of the story for you, although it is an interesting story. The important part of the story is that when you split this epidemic mortality, so the epidemics are these massive peaks this is all-cause mortality, all deaths, but you see these huge peaks compared with what you might think of as normal. When you split it by under 5 years, 5 to 49 years, and 50 plus years, you can see that the middle group, the 5 to 49 years, are just kind of going along the bottom. They have got a bit of a peak, but not massive. It's the small children who suffer hugely in terms of excess deaths in these epidemics. That's not surprising. Everybody knows that when you have, ecological disasters of one kind and another, children get hit. But what is interesting for our context here is that the 50-plus adults are almost as badly hit as the under 5. So the elderly are a vulnerable group. That's a very important lesson, because a lot of the kind of conventional wisdom that goes around is about child mortality, and it's terrible that all these children are dying, and yes, it is. It's absolutely terrible. But I think it's important to recognize that the elderly also can be a vulnerable group, just as small children can be a vulnerable group. So that's one point from Ethiopia. Then, in the same population, this is work from one of my PhD students a few years ago, we said, well, I wonder what happens for the people who do grow old in a community like Ethiopia. We know absolutely that most people don't grow old in a population like that, but of those who do, what's their life experience? So this is a graph that starts at 65th birthday, okay? So 0 time is 65th birthday, so 65, 75, 85, 95. Okay, survival. Pretty linear, pretty unremarkable. As I say, there's not a very big proportion of the population who ever get to this point, who ever start on this trajectory. But if you do start on that trajectory, you've actually got a pretty linear kind of survival experience well into high old age. And if you compare that with Sweden, I wonder how you think it might compare if we compare these 65-year-old life expectancy in Ethiopia and Sweden. And so Ethiopia is the solid line, the one you've just seen, that's men and women together, and Sweden is the dotted line. They're not very different. Very interesting. So for those who survive into old age, their subsequent survival actually is not that different from other populations. An interesting observation. Of course, it may be a kind of survival of the fittest. There's a question of what makes you survive to your 65th birthday in the first place. But interesting to know that from then on, you've got quite a reasonable survival chance. I've also looked at the projections related to population aging in Ethiopia, and I know you've seen lots of graphs of different kinds, but you haven't seen any from Ethiopia before, so I'm not too apologetic about it. This is from the UN Population Division. So crude mortality drops and then goes up again. This is from 1950 to 2100 now, so a 150 year life timescale. The proportion of 65 plus to the 15 to 64 plus, in other words, the dependency ratio of the elderly, that's the dark blue line, is going to shoot up. Many more older people. And similarly, the proportion of over 65 shoots up. Again, not terribly surprising, except that if I hadn't told you that this was Ethiopia, if I'd said, guess which country this is, I think it would have taken you some time to get there, to be honest. Because we're not kind of conditioned to think of a population like Ethiopia changing so drastically in terms of the proportion of old people as time goes forward. And if I do that, that's the same red line as we had on the last graph, and the blue line is now Sweden. What you see, this is a remarkable little take-home fact for you, that from roughly now, for about the next 60 years, mortality in Sweden will be substantially higher than it will be in Ethiopia, if you just look at crude mortality. Again, when you stop to analyze it, it's not that surprising, because it's a period during which Ethiopia will accumulate a whole lot of old people who will then go on to die, and that's why the Ethiopian curve then starts to go up again. But it's a very dynamic situation, this, and we need to grapple with these complex dynamics. So finally, just some points that I want to leave with you to think about. The first one, entirely obvious: increasing proportions of older people in populations worldwide. We know that. That's self-evident. But what are the implications of that? We're going to see increasing numbers in high incidence age groups for NCDs, non-communicable diseases. That's a massive deal when you look across the numbers in Africa and Asia. There's more and more people getting into the age groups where incidence of heart disease, incidence of cancer, incidence of diabetes starts going up. And that's why the World Health Assembly in May passed a resolution about reducing NCDs, but if you read the proper wording of it, and last week the Lancet misquoted it in their editorial, just in case you happen to be reading Lancet editorials, but if you get it right, they're talking about reducing premature mortality from NCDs, because there's no way we can reduce mortality from NCDs given all these millions and billions of older people that are going to be around. HIV/AIDS is becoming an older epidemic. That's going to be one of the features, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, for the next couple of decades. There's a massive cohort building of people who are HIV positive, increasingly on treatment, which is a good thing. It prolongs life, but that means you're going to have an elderly HIV positive cohort for the next few decades, and that's a new feature of the world. And because of all those reasons, health services need to make a transition from acute to chronic mode. Most health services in Africa and Asia have been about fixing your current acute problem, now antibiotics or whatever it might be, antimalarials. It's a complete philosophical change of how health services operate to say, well, people need antihypertensives for life, people need insulin for life, people need things on an ongoing basis. It completely changes the whole modus operandi of the health services. And it's a major, major implication. And obviously, as other people have been saying, for Sweden and for the rest of the world, important socioeconomic consequences, but particularly so in non-welfare states, which is typically what we're seeing in Africa and Asia. Thank you.